January 1945, somewhere in the frozen forests of East Prussia. The air smells of wet pine and ash. Snow clings to the skeletal branches overhead, muffling the sound of boots trudging through mud and ice. A column of women moves slowly along a dirt road, their faces obscured by grime, their hair matted beneath torn headscarves. They do not speak. They do not look at one another. Their eyes are fixed downward on the ground that has become their entire world. Among them is a woman who once taught piano in Berlin, another who worked in a munitions factory in Dresden, a third who served as a radio operator in occupied Poland. Their names do not matter now. Their pasts have been erased by years of war, by the relentless grinding of the Eastern Front, by the collapse of the Reich they were told would last 1,000 years. They are prisoners now, captured by Soviet forces in the chaotic retreat westward. Though the word prisoner feels inadequate to describe what they have become, they have not seen their reflections in 3 years. This is not a detail anyone would think to record in the official histories. The great sweeping narratives of the Second World War concern themselves with battles and borders, with the movements of armies and the decisions of generals. But there are smaller truths buried within the chaos. Truths that speak to the profound disintegration of identity that war inflicts upon those who endure it. The mirror, that most ordinary of objects, becomes in its absence a symbol of something deeper, the erasure of self, the loss of recognition, the slow dissolution of the person one used to be. To understand the women on that frozen road in January 1945, one must first understand the world that created them. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, the National Socialist vision of womanhood was clear and unambiguous. Women were to be the guardians of the home, the bearers of children, the preservers of racial purity. The Nazi slogan was simple: Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, children. Kitchen, church. Motherhood was elevated to the status of patriotic duty. The regime awarded medals to women who bore multiple children for the fatherland. The Mother Cruz, the Mother's Cross, came in bronze for 4 children, silver for 6, gold for 8 or more. But ideology is always the first casualty of total war. By 1942, the Eastern Front was consuming men at a rate that no nation could sustain indefinitely. The Wehrmacht was bleeding. The initial victories of Operation Barbarossa had given way to the grinding attrition of Stalingrad, the vast emptiness of the Russian steppe, the endless winters that froze fuel lines and turned steel brittle. Germany needed bodies. It needed labor. It needed hands to build fortifications, to operate radios, to drive trucks, to staff anti-aircraft batteries. And so the women were called. They did not go willingly at first. The propaganda had to shift, had to find a way to reconcile service with the sacred duty of motherhood. The regime created new categories: Blitzmodell, the Lightning Girls, who served as communications auxiliaries; Stabshelferinnen, staff helpers who worked in administrative roles; Flakhelferinnen, anti-aircraft assistants who operated searchlights and rangefinders. Officially, they were not soldiers. Officially, they did not bear arms, but the distinctions became meaningless as the war dragged on and the front lines blurred. By 1944, there were over 500,000 German women serving in auxiliary military roles. They wore uniforms. They lived in barracks. They followed orders. And when the Red Army began its inexorable push westward, they became targets. The women in the column that January morning had come from different places, different units, different lives, but they shared a common experience. They had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Maria, the former piano teacher, had volunteered for service in 1943. Her husband had been killed at Kursk. Her 2 sons were somewhere on the Western Front. She joined a signals unit stationed in Königsberg, operating radio equipment, relaying messages she did not fully understand. She told herself she was helping to protect what remained of Germany, though by then it was clear to anyone with eyes that Germany was not being protected but consumed. Greta, the factory worker, had been conscripted in late 1944. She had no choice in the matter. One day she was assembling artillery shells in Dresden. The next, she was on a train heading east, assigned to a labor battalion building defensive fortifications along the Vistula River. The work was brutal. The ground was frozen. The women dug with picks and shovels, their hands bleeding through torn gloves, their breath fogging in the sub-zero air. At night they slept in unheated barns, pressed together for warmth. Ilse, the radio operator, had been stationed in Warsaw during the uprising in 1944. She had heard the screams from the burning ghetto. She had seen the columns of smoke rising over the city. She had done her job, relaying coordinates, transcribing orders, telling herself that she was simply following protocol. When the Soviets encircled the city in January 1945, her unit attempted to evacuate westward. They made it 40 kilometers before Soviet tanks cut them off. None of them had looked in the mirror since 1942. This was not an oversight. Mirrors were not standard issue in military barracks. They were considered frivolous, unnecessary, a distraction from duty. In the forward areas, in the makeshift camps and bunkers where these women lived, there was no room for vanity. There was barely room for survival. Soap was scarce. Water was often frozen. The women washed when they could in rivers or from buckets, splashing icy water on their faces in the dark before dawn. They forgot slowly what they looked like. At first, the absence of mirrors was merely an inconvenience. They could still catch glimpses of themselves in polished metal, in window panes, in the surface of still water. But as the months passed, as the war intensified, and the conditions worsened, even these fragmentary reflections disappeared. The windows were shattered. The metal was tarnished. The water was always moving. They became strangers to themselves. The psychological literature on identity and self-recognition is unequivocal. The visual confirmation of one's own face is fundamental to the maintenance of a stable sense of self. Human beings are social creatures, and we construct our identities in part through the reflected gaze of others, both literally and metaphorically. We need to see ourselves seen. We need to know that we exist as discrete, recognizable individuals. Without mirrors, the women on the Eastern Front began to lose this anchor. They knew intellectually that they still possessed faces. They could touch their own cheeks, run their fingers through their hair, feel the contours of their noses and chins, but knowledge is not the same as recognition. The absence of visual confirmation created a subtle but profound disorientation. They began to feel like ghosts, like shadows, like something less than fully real. The effect was compounded by the conditions of war. The relentless cold-bleached color from everything. The women's skin became gray, chapped, cracked. Their hair grew brittle and dull. Their eyes sank into their skulls as malnutrition took hold. They lost weight. They lost teeth. They lost the softness that had once defined their features. But they could not see these changes. They could only feel them, indirectly, in the way their clothes no longer fit, in the way their rings slipped from their fingers, in the way men looked through them rather than at them. They expected, perhaps, that military service would be an extension of their domestic roles, that they would be supporting the men, caring for the wounded, maintaining order behind the lines. They expected that the war would end, as all wars eventually end, and they would return home to resume their lives. They expected recognition, gratitude, perhaps even honor. They did not expect to be erased. The capture came suddenly, as most captures do. In mid-January 1945, the Red Army launched the Vistula Oder offensive, a massive push westward involving over 2 million Soviet troops. The German defenses, already stretched to breaking, collapsed within days. Entire divisions were encircled. Supply lines disintegrated. Commanders lost contact with their units. In the chaos, thousands of German military personnel, men and women alike, found themselves cut off, surrounded with no option but surrender. Maria's signals unit was overrun on January 14th. The Soviets came at dawn, tanks rumbling through the frozen fields, infantry following close behind. There was no dramatic last stand, no heroic resistance. The commanding officer ordered the women to destroy the radio equipment, to burn the codebooks, and then to wait. They huddled in the basement of a farmhouse, listening to the sound of boots on the floor above them, knowing that their war was over. Greta's labor battalion was captured 2 days later, marching westward along a road clogged with refugees. Soviet cavalry swept down from the north, cutting off the column, herding the women into a frozen field. They stood in the snow for hours, waiting for someone to decide what to do with them. Some of the women wept. Others stood silent, too exhausted for emotion. Ilse's unit never formally surrendered. They simply scattered when the tanks appeared, running into the forest, trying to blend into the flood of displaced persons fleeing westward. Ilse made it 3 days before she was caught at a Soviet checkpoint, her papers identifying her as a former member of the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Services. She was placed in a holding area with dozens of other women, all of them filthy, all of them frightened, all of them trying to calculate the odds of survival. The Soviets were not gentle with German prisoners. The Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses. Over 20 million Soviet citizens would die before the war's end. Entire cities had been razed. Civilians had been massacred. The soldiers moving westward in 1945 were not in a forgiving mood. They had seen what the Wehrmacht had done to their country, and they intended to repay the debt. For German women, capture by Soviet forces was particularly dangerous. Rape was widespread, systematic, a weapon of vengeance and terror. The exact numbers will never be known, but historians estimate that between 1 and 2 million German women were sexually assaulted by Soviet soldiers during the final months of the war and the occupation that followed. The assaults occurred everywhere in Berlin, in the countryside, in refugee camps and prisons. The women in the columns knew this. They had heard the stories, they had seen the aftermath. They understood that surrender did not mean safety. And yet for some, surrender also meant an unexpected reprieve. Not all Soviet units behaved the same way. Discipline varied depending on the commander, the circumstances, the mood of the men. Some units committed atrocities as a matter of course. Others maintained a degree of order, particularly in areas where military governance was quickly established. The women who were captured in mid-January found themselves in a shifting landscape of control and chaos, where their fate depended on factors they could neither predict nor influence. Maria's group was initially held in a former German barracks. The conditions were harsh but not murderous. They were given thin soup, black bread, a corner to sleep. The Soviet guards were distant, watchful, but not immediately violent. Maria spent her days sitting on the floor, staring at the wall, trying to comprehend the fact that the war was over for her. Greta was less fortunate. Her column was marched eastward for days, through towns and villages that had been obliterated by fighting. At night, they slept in ruins and basements in the open air. Some of the women died of exposure. Others simply vanished, pulled away by soldiers in the dark. Greta survived by making herself invisible, by keeping her head down, by never making eye contact. Ilse was transferred to a larger holding facility near Posen, a former school building that had been converted into a temporary prison. There were hundreds of women there, German and Polish and Hungarian, all of them waiting to be processed, to be sorted, to be sent somewhere else. The days blurred together. The women spoke little. They huddled for warmth. They tried to steal extra scraps of food. They listened to the rumors that they would be sent to labor camps in Siberia, that they would be executed, that they would be released, that they would never leave. And through it all, they did not see their faces. The mirror arrived in March. It was not a grand gesture, not a planned act of mercy. It was a logistical accident, a byproduct of the Red Army's chaotic occupation infrastructure. The Soviet authorities were attempting to organize the prisoner population, to separate civilians from military personnel, to identify those who might be charged with war crimes. This required documentation, photographs, records. And for photographs, one needed to look presentable. The order came down from some anonymous bureaucrat in some distant office. The female prisoners were to be cleaned up for processing. They were to be deloused, given clean clothing if available, and allowed to make themselves presentable for identification photographs. It was a pragmatic decision, not a humanitarian one. The Soviets needed clear images for their files, but to the women, the implications were staggering. They were taken in groups to a wash house that had been set up in a former bathhouse in the town. The water was cold, but it was running. They were given coarse soap and told to scrub. They stood under the showers, shivering, feeling the grime of months sluice away, watching the water at their feet turn gray with dirt and lice and the accumulated filth of the Eastern Front. And then, as they dried themselves with rough towels, one of the Soviet matrons gestured toward the wall. There, propped against the tile, was a mirror. It was not large, perhaps a meter tall, half a meter wide. The glass was slightly tarnished, the frame chipped. It had probably been salvaged from some bombed-out building, some looted apartment. It was utterly ordinary, but to the women who had not seen their reflections in 3 years, it was a portal to another world. Maria was among the first group taken to the wash house. She had been anticipating the shower, the chance to feel clean, but she had not thought about the mirror. When she stepped out from the shower area, toweling her hair, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass. She stopped. For a moment, she did not recognize the woman staring back at her. The face in the mirror was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, the skin stretched tight over prominent bones. The eyes were sunken, ringed with dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights and relentless stress. The hair, still wet, hung limp and thin, streaked with gray that Maria did not remember having. The woman in the mirror looked 50 years old, perhaps older. Maria was 37. She stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. She raised a hand to her face, touched her cheek, watched the reflection do the same. The disconnect was profound. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, a ghost, a survivor of something Maria could not fully comprehend, even though she had lived through it herself. Behind her, other women were emerging from the showers. They too saw the mirror. They too stopped, transfixed, horrified, unable to reconcile the image before them with the memory of who they had been. One woman began to cry. Another turned away, covering her face with her hands. A third simply stared, her expression blank, as if the shock had short-circuited her capacity for emotion. Greta, when her turn came a week later, had a different reaction. She looked at her reflection and felt a surge of rage. She had been young once, pretty even, with clear skin and bright eyes, and a smile that made men notice her. The woman in the mirror was none of those things. The woman in the mirror was wrecked, used up, discarded. Greta wanted to smash the glass to destroy the evidence of what the war had done to her, but she did not. She simply looked, and eventually turned away. Ilse did not cry. She did not rage. She studied her reflection with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a specimen. She noted the changes methodically, the weight loss, the premature aging, the dullness in her eyes. She tried to find something familiar, some remnant of the woman she had been before the war. She found nothing. The woman in the mirror was someone else entirely, someone Ilse did not know and did not particularly wish to know. The psychological impact of that moment cannot be overstated. In the brutal calculus of war, the mirror might seem trivial. These women had survived bombings, starvation, sexual violence, the collapse of their entire world. They had endured horrors that would leave scars for the rest of their lives. What did it matter that they finally saw their reflections? It mattered because the mirror forced them to confront the totality of their loss. Until that moment, the degradation had been abstract. They knew they were suffering. They knew they were changing. But knowledge is one thing. Confrontation is another. The mirror made the invisible visible. It took the vague sense of erosion and crystallized it into a single, undeniable image. It showed them what the war had stolen, but it also did something more subtle, more insidious. The mirror reminded them that they were still individuals. For 3 years, they had been part of a mass, a column, a unit, a batch of prisoners. They had been processed, categorized, herded. Their individual identities had been subsumed into the collective experience of war. They were numbers, roles, functions. They were Blitzmedell, Flakhelferinnen, enemy combatants, prisoners. They were not Maria or Greta or Ilse. The mirror gave them back their faces, and with their faces came the crushing weight of selfhood, the realization that they were singular beings who had to carry the memory of what had happened to them. They could no longer hide in the anonymity of the group. They were themselves again, and that self was broken. The mirrors, once introduced, became a fixture in the processing centers. The Soviet authorities, having decided that presentable photographs were necessary, made an effort to provide basic grooming facilities. More mirrors appeared, scavenged from the ruins of German cities, installed in wash houses and holding areas throughout the occupied territories. And the women, despite the pain of that first encounter, kept returning to them. It is a paradox of trauma. We are drawn to the things that hurt us. The women looked at their reflections obsessively, compulsively, as if by staring long enough they might understand what had happened, might find some explanation in the lines of their faces. They studied themselves the way one studies a map of an unfamiliar country, trying to navigate terrain they no longer recognized. Some women tried to repair the damage. They used scraps of cloth to fashion makeshift ribbons for their hair. They pinched their cheeks to bring color to their skin. They borrowed bits of charcoal to darken their eyebrows, stolen lipstick to redden their lips. The efforts were pathetic, futile, but they were efforts nonetheless. They were attempts to reclaim some small measure of control, to assert that they were not just bodies but persons, not just prisoners but women. Others gave up entirely. They looked in the mirror once and then avoided it thereafter. covering the glass with towels or turning their backs. They decided that the woman in the reflection was not worth knowing, not worth saving. They let her go. And a very few looked in the mirror and felt something unexpected. Relief. Relief that they had survived. Relief that they were still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling anything at all. The face in the mirror was ravaged, yes, but it was alive. It was proof that they had endured. And in a war that had consumed millions, survival was its own form of victory. The mirrors also revealed something else, something the women had not anticipated. The erasure of distinctions. Before the war, these women had come from different social classes, different regions, different ideological backgrounds. Maria had been educated, cultured, a member of the urban middle class. Greta had been working class, rough-edged, accustomed to hard labor. Ilse had been a true believer, a member of the Nazi Women's League, proud of her service to the fatherland. But in the mirror, they all looked the same. The same gaunt faces, the same hollow eyes, the same brittle hair. The war had ground away the superficial markers of identity, the distinctions of class and education and belief. It had reduced them to a common denominator, suffering. This was, in its way, a revelation. The ideology that had sent them to war had promised hierarchy, order, racial purity, the supremacy of the German Volk. It had promised that their sacrifices would be rewarded, that their loyalty would be honored, that they were part of something greater than themselves. The mirror showed them the truth. They were not special. They were not chosen. They were simply human, and humanity is fragile, and the war had broken them just as it had broken millions of others. This realization cut deep. For the true believers like Ilse, it was devastating. She had staked her identity on the righteousness of the cause, on the promise that her suffering had meaning. The mirror stripped that away. It showed her that she was not a warrior for the Reich, but a victim of a failed ideology, no different from the Polish women or the Russian women or any other women caught in the war's machinery. For others, the realization was oddly liberating. If they were all the same, then perhaps the old hierarchies no longer mattered. Perhaps the distinctions of rank and class had been burned away in the crucible of war, leaving something more fundamental, more honest. But that liberation was cold comfort. It did not change the fact that they were prisoners. It did not change the fact that their lives had been shattered. It only meant that they would rebuild, if they rebuilt at all, on a foundation of shared trauma rather than shared ideology. The photographs were taken in early April. The women were lined up, given numbers to hold in front of their chests, and instructed to stare straight ahead. The photographer was a Soviet soldier who looked bored, who snapped picture after picture with mechanical efficiency. The flashbulb popped. The shutter clicked. The moment was recorded. Years later, historians would find these photographs in Soviet archives. They would study the faces, try to identify the women, piece together their stories. The photographs would become documents, evidence, artifacts of a particular moment in the collapse of the Third Reich. But in the moment, the photographs were simply another form of erasure. The women were reduced once again to images, to data points, to entries in a file. The brief confrontation with their own faces in the mirror was archived, frozen, made into history. The story of the mirrors did not end with the photographs. As the war drew to a close and the occupation regime solidified, the Soviet authorities began to sort the prisoners more systematically. Some women were released, sent back to what remained of Germany to fend for themselves. Others were transferred to labor camps in the Soviet Union, sentenced to years of hard labor as reparations for the war. A few were tried for war crimes, particularly those who had served in the SS or the concentration camp system. Maria was released in June 1945. She returned to Berlin to find her apartment building reduced to rubble. She had nowhere to go. No family left alive. No means of support. She survived by scavenging, by trading cigarettes and ration cards, by doing whatever work she could find. She never played the piano again. Her hands, damaged by frostbite and malnutrition, could no longer manage the keys. Greta was sent to a labor camp in Ukraine. She spent 3 years cutting timber in the forests, living in a barracks, subsisting on cabbage soup and black bread. She was released in 1948 and made her way back to Dresden, which had been obliterated by Allied bombing. She remarried, had children, lived a quiet life. She never spoke about the war. never told her family what had happened to her. The memories were too painful, too private. Ilza was tried by a Soviet military tribunal and sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp. She served 8 years in Kazakhstan before being released in 1953. She returned to East Germany and found work as a clerk. She lived alone, surrounded by books, reading voraciously, trying to understand how the world she had believed in had come to such a catastrophic end. She died in 1987, never having fully reconciled the woman she had been with, the woman she became. But the mirrors remained in the decades after the war. As the trauma of 1945 slowly receded into history, the mirror emerged as a potent symbol in the literature and testimony of women who had survived the conflict. It appears again and again in memoirs, in oral histories, in interviews. Women describe the shock of seeing themselves after months or years of deprivation. They describe the sense of dislocation, the feeling of looking at a stranger. They describe the slow, painful process of recognizing that the stranger was themselves. The mirror became a metaphor for the war's impact on identity, on selfhood, on the relationship between inner and outer reality. It represented the moment when the abstract experience of suffering became concrete, when the invisible damage became visible. But it also represented something else: the persistence of vanity, of self-regard, of the human desire to be seen. Even in the midst of total war, even after years of brutality and degradation, the women cared what they looked like. They wanted to recognize themselves. They wanted to be recognizable. This was not shallowness or frivolity. It was a fundamental assertion of humanity. It was a refusal to be erased. The Nazis had tried to reduce women to functions, mothers, workers, auxiliaries. The war had tried to reduce them to victims, prisoners, refugees, casualties. But the mirror reminded them that they were individuals, that they had faces, that they existed as singular, irreplaceable beings, and in a war that sought to extinguish individuality. That assertion mattered. The American experience of the war was different in almost every respect. When American forces liberated concentration camps and prisoner-of-war facilities in 1945, they were shocked by what they found. The skeletal inmates, the mass graves, the evidence of systematic starvation and abuse, all of it was documented, photographed, reported back home. The American public, insulated from the worst horrors of the war by geography and military success, struggled to comprehend the scale of the atrocity. But the Americans also brought with them a different ideology, a different set of assumptions about human dignity and individual worth. American soldiers carried with them not just weapons and rations, but symbols of abundance: chocolate bars, cigarettes, nylon stockings, cosmetics. These items, trivial in themselves, became powerful tokens of a different way of life. They represented a world where even in wartime there was enough food, enough material, enough to spare for luxuries. When American forces encountered female prisoners, whether concentration camp survivors or captured German auxiliaries, they offered these tokens freely. They handed out lipstick and compacts, soap and mirrors, not as calculated propaganda, but as simple gestures of humanity. They could not comprehend a world in which such basic items were unavailable. A world in which women went years without seeing their own faces. The contrast was stark. The Soviet liberators arrived with vengeance and trauma, carrying the scars of a nation that had been nearly destroyed. The American liberators arrived with abundance, carrying the confidence of a nation that had emerged from the war stronger than ever. And the mirrors they provided were different, too. They were mass-produced, factory-made, identical. They were symbols of industrial capacity, of a society organized around production and consumption. They were not scavenged from ruins but shipped across the Atlantic, part of the vast logistical apparatus that had won the war. To the women who received them, these mirrors were revelations. They were proof that another world existed, a world where ordinary things were available to ordinary people, a world where survival did not consume every waking moment. In the displaced persons camps that sprang up across Europe in the aftermath of the war, mirrors became tools of rehabilitation. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, working with American military authorities, established camps to house the millions of refugees and displaced persons created by the conflict. These camps were chaotic, overcrowded, under-resourced, but they also represented an attempt to restore a sense of normalcy, to help survivors transition from the extremity of war to something resembling ordinary life. Part of that process involved restoring a sense of personal dignity. The camp administrators provided not just food and shelter, but also grooming supplies, clothing, and yes, mirrors. They understood intuitively that recovery was not just physical but psychological. People needed to feel like themselves again. They needed to look in a mirror and see not a victim, but a person. For many women, this process was agonizing. The first look in a mirror after liberation was often as traumatic as the first look in the Soviet washhouses. They saw the same gaunt faces, the same hollow eyes. But over time, with adequate food and rest, the reflections began to change. Color returned to cheeks. Eyes brightened. Hair regained its luster. The transformation was slow but undeniable. And with the physical recovery came a tentative psychological recovery. The women began to care about their appearance again, not out of vanity, but out of a desire to reclaim some measure of control. They experimented with hairstyles, borrowed cosmetics, tried to reconstruct the women they had been before the war. The efforts were often heartbreaking in their modesty, a bit of rouge. A carefully combed curl, but they were efforts nonetheless. The mirror became a tool of transformation, a way of marking the passage from victimhood to survival. But the recovery was never complete. The women who had seen themselves in those Soviet mirrors, who had confronted the full extent of the war's damage, could not unsee what they had seen. The image was burned into their memories, a permanent reminder of what they had endured. Even as their bodies healed, even as they regained weight and strength, they carried with them the knowledge of how close they had come to total erasure. This knowledge shaped the rest of their lives. Many women who survived the war found it difficult to form relationships, to trust others, to believe in the possibility of happiness. They had learned that the world was fundamentally unsafe, that institutions could not be trusted, that the veneer of civilization was thin. They raised their children with a kind of anxious vigilance, always preparing for the next catastrophe. Others channeled their trauma into activism, into efforts to prevent future wars, to document atrocities, to bear witness. They understood that their survival carried with it an obligation to remember, to testify, to ensure that the lessons of the war were not forgotten. And some simply tried to forget, to bury the memories, to move on. They rarely spoke of the war. They avoided mirrors when they could, uncomfortable with the self-scrutiny, with the memories it triggered. They lived quiet lives, ordinary lives, lives defined by the effort not to remember. The mirror, in the end, was more than an object. It was a fulcrum, a point of transformation around which the entire experience of war pivoted. Before the mirror, the women existed in a kind of twilight, suspended between their former lives and an uncertain future. They knew they had changed, but the change was abstract, shapeless. They could not see it, could not name it. The mirror made it real. It forced confrontation. It demanded recognition. And in that recognition, painful as it was, there was also a kind of liberation. The women could no longer pretend that the war had not touched them, could no longer cling to the illusion that they were the same people they had been in 1939. They had to accept the transformation, to integrate it, to find a way to live with the woman in the mirror. This process, the process of integrating trauma, of accepting change, of learning to live with what has been lost, is the work of a lifetime. It is never finished. There is no final resolution, no moment when the pain disappears and everything is suddenly okay. But there is, perhaps, a kind of hard-won wisdom, a recognition that survival itself is a form of resistance, that the simple act of continuing to exist, of looking in the mirror and accepting the face that looks back, is a refusal to be destroyed. In the years that followed the war, as Europe rebuilt and the world moved into the Cold War era, the story of the female prisoners and their mirrors faded from public consciousness. It was too small, too personal, too uncomfortable. The grand narratives of the war focused on battles and heroes, on the clash of ideologies and the march of armies. There was little room for stories about women and mirrors, about the slow erosion of identity and the painful process of recovery. But the women remembered. They passed the stories down to their daughters and granddaughters, often in fragments and half-told anecdotes shared late at night. They spoke of the cold, the hunger, the fear, and they spoke of the mirror, of the moment when they saw themselves and did not recognize what they saw. These stories, quiet and private, form a counter-narrative to the official history of the war. They remind us that war is not just about nations and ideologies, but about individuals, about the intimate and often invisible ways that violence reshapes human beings. They remind us that the damage of war is not limited to the battlefield, but extends into the most personal realms of identity and selfhood. And they remind us that recovery, when it comes, is hard-won and incomplete. A daily act of courage rather than a single triumphant moment. The mirror, then, is not just a symbol of vanity or self-regard. It is a symbol of recognition of the self, of the other, of the shared humanity that war seeks to obliterate. When the women on that frozen road in January 1945 were finally given mirrors, they were being offered more than a chance to see their faces. They were being offered a chance to reclaim their identities, to assert that they were still here, still alive, still capable of being seen. It was a small gesture in the context of total war, but for the women who received it, it was everything. Because in the end, to be seen is to exist. To recognize oneself is to survive. And to survive is to refuse, however quietly, to be erased. The war took many things from these women: their homes, their families, their youth, their innocence. But it could not take their faces. It could not take the fundamental fact of their existence. The mirror, tarnished and scavenged and ordinary as it was, reflected that truth back to them. And in that reflection, however painful, there was also a kind of defiant hope. They were still here. They were still themselves. And that, in the end, was enough.